Hello, History 363. So today we're going to continue to talk about social strife in the early Roman Republic. In the 5th century, Rome is governed by annually elected magistrates. They're usually called consuls, although there is some evidence that suggests that they may have actually been called praetors, but we're going to call them consuls. There's two of them elected every year, both patricians. Remember, the patricians, an aristocratic caste, have monopolized both high office as well as the priesthoods in Rome. So they control political and sacral power, and there's not that many of them. There's perhaps 25 patrician families, which means there may only be about 2 patricians who are eligible to be consul every year, which means many of these elections may not even be contested at all beyond just kind of acclamation of the winners. Now, it does seem that the governance of these patrician magistrates is brutal, and that they have basically arbitrary powers to inflict capital punishment and corporal punishment. And indeed, the power to inflict capital and corporal punishment, the power that's granted to a magistrate, is called Imperium. The Romans see it as integral into the right to the ability to command soldiers. But also magistrates are granted it in peacetime, and an Imperium is embodied in the fasces. A fasces is a bundle of rods with an axe in the center. And these fasces are carried by bodyguards called lictors. So every Roman consul has 12 lictors who precede him, and each of them is carrying one of these fasces. The idea of the fasces is that if the consul sees somebody that he feels needs to be flogged, he can order his lictors to unbind the fasces and take the rods and use them to flog somebody. And these are sticks. This is not a whipping. This is a brutal, crippling beating. So, if need be, order the lictors to take the axe and decapitate somebody. And again, early on, these are the orders of the magistrates, cannot be appealed. And so this gives, of course, the consuls extraordinary power over their fellow citizens. Now, of course, the fasces have a long history as a potent symbol. During the Roman Republic, and even beyond, in fact, if you look in the United States Congress today, you can see fasces on the walls. They're still used as symbols of lawful civic authority. Despite the fact that they are literally tools of beating and execution. It would be the equivalent. Imagine if there was a noose or a guillotine on the halls of Congress. That would be shocking. But the fasces is to beat and decapitate somebody with. Now, you might one thing that I think makes them a symbol of lawful authority is the fact that ordinarily they're carried bound up in a bundle. That is, a Roman consul, if he wants to order somebody flogged or decapitated, can give the order. But then there's a pause, because it takes lictors time to unbind the fasces, to take out the axe. It's not an instantaneous sort of Queen of Hearts, off with their heads. And in that pause, the magistrate has the ability to reconsider his decision, decide maybe he ordered it too rashly, can perhaps listen to the panicked appeal of the person he's threatening with punishment. I think that's why they're associated with civic authority. There are tools of flogging and execution, but they're kind of clumsy. There's a kind of built-in pause to them. Now, of course, with Mussolini, they subsequently become symbols of simply grand, raw political power, hence of the fascists, and certainly they haven't lost that connotation in the early 21st century. Even if you can still see them, around the United States, usually sort of hearkening to the more traditional vision of lawful civic authority. But suffice it to say, that's the rule by the patricians. It is a rule that is enforced by floggings and executions, and potentially quite arbitrary ones at that. Now, again, there are many plebeians who are unhappy with the circumstances. There are poor plebeians who suffer from famine, food shortages, land shortages, and also with debt. And then there are wealthy plebeians who have a lot of land, but somehow miss that cut when this sort of caste of families comes together and says, you know what, we're the only people who can exercise political and sacral power in the city of Rome. There's plebeian families say, hey, I'm just as rich, I've got just as much land, I have just as nice of things. Why can't I be consul? Why can't I be Pontifex Maximus? And these plebeians are eventually going to get together and form essentially kind of either alternate state or sort of parallel state to the Roman state that is controlled by patrician magistrates and priests. And one tactic that they have to sort of create the space for this alternate state to exist, with the patricians walking around with their rods and axes looking for people to beat, they have to be forced to concede the rights of the plebeians to self-organize. But the way that they do that is essentially through a general strike, through a Circassio, in which the plebeians simply say, we quit, we're leaving the city, we're going away. Oftentimes this is associated with some kind of potential military threat. So if the plebeians, who are the bulk of the citizen body and the bulk of the army, to say, hey, we're going somewhere else, we're camping out somewhere else, the patricians may have to pay attention if they need that manpower for the army. The first Circassio is, again, supposedly in 494. The plebeians go all the way to the sacred, to a place called the Mons Sacra, which is the sacred mountain, probably several miles outside of Rome. So actually physically leaving the city and camping out somewhere else. Later strikes, later Circassiones, will oftentimes take place in the Aventine Hill. And the Aventine Hill is strongly associated with sort of plebeian collective identity, particularly around the temple of Ceres on the Aventine Hill. Ceres is the goddess of agriculture, of grain, and you can see why that might be a kind of plebeian goddess. The people who are small farmers spend a lot of their time working the land. So what the concession that is sort of wrought from this and future general strikes is the ability of the plebeians to have their own state officers. And the most important plebeian officials are called tribunes of the plebs. And these are elected by the assembly of the plebeians, the concilium plebis. So that means the plebeians have their own voting assembly, and now they have their own sort of officers. The way that the plebeians empower the tribunes of the plebs, because again, there is no Roman constitution, there's no written document for everyone to consult. The way that the tribunes claim power, including the power to go and intercede against whatever the consuls are doing, is the plebeians supposedly swear an oath, making the tribunes of the plebs sacrosanct, saying if anyone harms the tribunes of the plebs, we will hunt them down and kill them. And there's a lot of us, and we've all sworn to do it. And so the fact that tribunes are sacrosanct, the fact that, hey, if you lay a hand on a tribune, a lot of people are coming to kill you, means that tribunes will now be able to say, I'm going to walk up to a consul and say, hey, stop that now. I'm standing here, and you want to beat and flog and decapitate that guy? Nope, I'm standing in front, and you ain't getting there. Over my dead body, and you don't want that. I'm sacrosanct. And indeed, eventually we'll hear of instances of actually the tribunes, because they're sacrosanct, taking the consuls and throwing them in jail. And who's going to stop me? I am sacrosanct. The sort of tools that the tribunes have, again, particularly involve stopping magisterial action, oftentimes action against a Roman citizen, but also potentially actions that the plebs themselves simply don't like, or at least the tribunes of the plebs claiming to represent the broader plebs don't like. And this is called InterCasio, where a tribune goes up to a consul and says, veto, I forbid it. I forbid you from decapitating him. I forbid you from undertaking this policy. And so this is where we actually get the veto comes from, the sort of I forbid it being uttered by a tribune to a consul. So the tribunes, again, are these officials who represent the plebs. In some ways, they're kind of representative of this broader part of Roman society. and yet also can intercede to prevent certain actions that are done to disadvantage the plebs or perceived to disadvantage the plebs. There's one other important officer that's elected, and that is an aedile. The aediles may sort of start off as kind of sacristans of the Temple of Ceres, but they pretty quickly take on a sort of series of kind of city manager functions. Ediles keep the streets swept. Ediles regulate the markets. Ediles ensure that the grain markets are running properly. And of course, this may actually be that the patricians are not really interested in good governance. I mean, there's only a small number of families. Anyone who wants to be consul, any male from those families who lives to the right age, will probably be consul. They don't need to do good governance. So the ediles seem to be sort of plebeian representatives who are there just to keep the streets clean, to make sure the markets are regulated, to do those kinds of things that maybe the patricians aren't bothering to do. So you have plebeian tribunes, plebeian ediles, a concilium plebis, a council of the plebs, and together these represent the kind of parallel state or alternate state that the plebeians set up for themselves. Again, and the patricians acquiesce to this in part because these general strikes force the concessions that allow carve out the space for this alternate state to exist. Now, the first 50 years, the first 2 generations of the Roman Republic may be seen, and Harriet Flower at Princeton University has sort of dubbed this period an experiment. We actually shouldn't see this as anything other than an experiment in non-monarchic rule after the sudden and perhaps unanticipated expulsion of the kings. Around the 450s into the 440s, the Romans seem to start kind of more seriously rethinking how their republic should work. And the first step in that is summoning a commission of 10 men, decem viri, to produce a written law code. And indeed, we have very strong parallels from archaic Greece. We know many early Greek city-states are riven by social strife. And we also know that one solution they tend to come up with is the production of a public law code. Doesn't solve everything, but now everyone at least knows what the law is. A magistrate can't simply say, well, this is what the law is, and it is. And of course, people can also, if they realize what the law is, because it's public, because it's written down, because the information is available to everyone, people might actually start realizing, how they can mobilize the law better. So we see written law codes popping up in archaic Greece in the 7th century BC, and this seems to be an important moment in kind of the community formation there of Greek polis. And in 451, the Romans say, we're going to put together a commission of 10 men, and they're going to produce 12 tables. And these are going to be incised in bronze, and it's going to mostly deal, and you're reading it right now, with kind of the traditional law of an agricultural society. How far apart do fields have to be so that people can turn their plows? What are the rules for making sure people don't steal fruit or destroy crops? You will note that many of the laws actually reflect a real archaic severity. Just because this is a kind of, in part, a reform, doesn't mean that the laws are advantageous towards, say, debtors. In fact, the law of debt in the 12 Tables is remarkably savage. If someone owes you money and doesn't pay, as long as you go through the proper procedure of basically notifying, giving them the time to repay the debt and notifying them. But eventually you can chain them up in your basement. Eventually, if you want, you can sell them into slavery across the Tiber, and that's how you discharge the debt. You also, if there's multiple people who can claim the person, there is some kind of cutting, partus sequanto. They shall cut to pieces. And there's still debate. There's sort of two sides. There's like, oh no, they must just mean we can divide the property of the debtor between creditors. Reasonable. There's others who say, no, this seems to actually refer to literally cutting the person up, the kind of Tony Soprano style enforcement of a debt for somebody who couldn't pay. And either the cutting up forces the family to get together some money so this terrible thing doesn't happen, or hey, next guy won't make the same mistake. Regardless, it's a very, very severe law of debt, particularly at a time when we know that debt is something that is oppressing many poor plebeians. They may get this put out in the public, but it's not necessarily advantageous to someone who, say, crop has failed and they need to borrow to plant the next crop for the following harvest. Now, there is a tradition that the decemvirs, having promulgated these codes, and the Romans sort of believed that the first 10 are pretty good laws, the last 2 are maybe not so good laws, including a law against intermarriage between patricians and plebeians. But there is a story that the decemvirs don't want to let go. They plan to simply hang around. And they're foiled when one of their number, a patrician named Appius Claudius, decides that he wants to rape a beautiful plebeian virgin whose name just happens to be Virginia. And given that he's just set up a law code in the story, and I would stress this is a story, right? We've already, just with Lucretia, clearly the Romans are using sexual assault as a metaphor for misgovernance. But he plans to rape her through a legal mechanism. That is, having a henchman claim her as his slave. And Roman law actually has a problem. Slaves can't sue. So if you're a free person and someone manages to claim you plausibly as a slave, now as you actually have to rely on a friend or a relative to sue on your behalf. So this is how he's going to enslave Virginia. This might work, except her father, supposedly a brave centurion in the Roman army, to prevent her from being defiled by this nasty, lecherous patrician decemvir, kills his daughter. So again, the Romans, they use sort of sexual assault as a metaphor, but frequently, as with Lucretia, liquidate the chaste female heroine. This is a story written by the patriarchy. So Virginius kills his daughter and subsequently becomes a leader, suppose he's elected tribune of the plebs, and the plebs have another Circassio, and the decemvirs are forced to leave. Now, again, there's a lot in that story that is implausible, although the 440s is going to continue to be a period of reform. So among other things, we're going to see a new magistrate created, the censor, and the censor is going to conduct the census, actually determining how much money each Roman citizen has, and that will determine where they serve in the army, whether they serve as heavy infantry or light infantry or don't serve in the army at all because they're too poor. So this seems to also reflect a new attempt to sort of structure the citizen body, probably formalizing some of the earlier attempts to create a kind of hoplite heavy infantry muster under the late kings, attributed to Servius Tullius. Also, the Romans start experimenting with, instead of electing 2 patrician consuls, they start experimenting electing 3 to 4 to 6 consular tribunes, or military tribunes with consular powers. A mysterious position, but one that will actually predominate between 444 down to 367. This is actually going to be the main executive officers of the state. In most years, the Romans don't elect consuls, although they kind of all. But this sort of board is going to be one of the most common forms of executive power, again, until 367. Still mysterious. It's unclear if our Roman sources, writing centuries after the fact, understood them very well. Historians still argue about them all the time. My own sort of spicy take, we might consider these to be sort of parallel to the boards of generals, strategoi, that we see in both Athens and also many other Greek communities, including Greek communities relatively close to Rome, or at least in Magna Graeca, like Syracuse and Tarentum. So it may be that this is a constitutional form. Instead of having 2 very, very powerful magistrates, what if we have a somewhat larger board of military officers running the state? Well, again, not a military junta. These guys are elected every year. If one reason this may help keep the peace a bit is that while plebeians still can't be consul in the years when consuls are elected, some plebeians are allowed to be military tribunes, even if the vast number of military tribunes are still patricians. So this may also allow some plebeians to have, again, limited and modified access to the secular executive power in the Roman state. That being said, the struggle of the orders is far from over, despite the really significant reforms that are taking place from the late 450s into the 440s that really restructure what the Roman Republic looks like. And so we'll talk about the main resolution of the struggle of the orders in the middle of the 4th century next time. I'll see you then.